Welcome back, everybody. So at this point, usually we would be getting ready for our final keynote and wrapping up towards a reception and then a dinner. You know, that's one of the real strengths of UK PONI is being able to build that community. Which hopefully we'll be able to do later on in the year. So for those of you who weren't there for my opening talk, who weren't dialing in for my opening talk, we are still going to try and fulfill the mandate that we have of connecting the community up with each other, as well as doing this showcasing and analyzing activity. We're also going to, as soon as pandemic circumstances permit, try and have a proper celebration of 10 years of UK PONI and of all of you who make the community what it is. Obviously, circumstances at the moment preclude that. But I think what we've shown about over the last 2.5 days, the last 3 days, is really that the strength of next generation thinking, of emerging thinking on these issues is really very potent indeed. Some very, very creative ideas on deeply difficult topics, things which people find very hard to discuss. So on the first day, of course, we discussed emerging technologies, had a fantastic keynote for Dr. Pippa Malmgren. I'm really looking forward to watching that one back on YouTube when we get it up there. So for those of you who didn't manage to dial in on the first day, I highly recommend it. A very good and interesting conversation also about how we can adapt ourselves to get used to this world that I think all of our speakers and, you know, experts as well struggle with passing. How are we going to fit in a rapidly evolving technological picture with our established systems of deterrence, our established systems of international relations, the way that we think about ourselves and how we fit into it? I don't think any of us have amazing answers for that right now, and particularly the question of regulation and control of technologies like that it is a particularly vexed one. And what our speaker then suggested was maybe we need to think about ourselves a little bit differently. We need to think about broadening ourselves, about being adaptable, and about being resilient, and prioritizing resilience over efficiency. I think that's quite an interesting message for us to take away, particularly the one about broadening, which, if anything, UK PONI really does seek to do, to connect up people from a technical background, from those with a more policy background. As some of you know, I straddle that boundary myself, and UK PONI has always helped me out, and I hope it can do with some or indeed all of you. Yesterday we had a fantastic set of conversations as well, particularly about those issues, sustaining and developing expertise in the next generation. And it's always great to hear from people who are actually, you know, living it, really, people who are feeling the challenges, people who have the key questions about, you know, where am I going to go and how am I going to get there, and how can the community around me help do that. And it was a delight to welcome back some of our former say, UK PONI alumni and current board members as well to give their views on how to navigate the field. One issue that has been a very strong theme throughout the conference is the need for diversity of thought, diversity of background, for inclusivity in everything that we do, something that UK PONI has increasingly tried to do. I think we're not, you know, by any means all of the way there, and we have a long way to go in some areas in particular. Events of recent weeks have highlighted one area in particular where we need to do more, I think. But we are taking steps, I hope, in the right direction, and we remain open to course corrections, challenges and suggestions from everybody who wants to work with us on that. It's something that we're deeply committed to. So, and I'm delighted as well that we were able to conclude that day's proceedings with a keynote from Azumi Nakamitsu, Under Secretary General of the UN. Quite a coup. We're very delighted. We're delighted to have her with us. She spoke very persuasively about the need for nations to work together, which is kind of interesting because today we have had a set of discussions about how competition really, rather than cooperation, might be the dominant paradigm. So she has a very difficult job to do, which I think she does. She and her team discharge extremely well, but they do need the cooperation of others. And I think I suspect we're going to hear a little bit later on from our keynote today, Angus Lapsley, about that competitive environment and how the UK, which has always really prized multilateralism, as I think still continues to do, tries to navigate that competitive world. I don't envy him his challenge either, but I'm sure he's going to lay out very well exactly how we look to meet it. Today, we obviously pushed the envelope as well on our experimentation with how we can use this online format. UK PONI, before this conference, has run an online interactive exercise. We did another one today during the conference, which, although very compressed, I think has shown what we can do to use this medium to reach more people. And I think many people have been saying it, but I suspect it's very true for UK PONI as well, that you know, in a way, by forcing us to use these new media, new technologies, or even old technologies that we really weren't taking advantage of more effectively, this is going to be something that we take with us out of the pandemic as well, I think. So hopefully, although we're not able to meet in person, although we're not able to connect in person, and there is in some way no real replacement for that, there are going to be things that we can do to broaden our reach, to connect more internationally, and to bring probably a greater variety of voices in front of the UK PONI community. So as we look back 10 years from where we started with our ambition of running a single conference to rival what was then the US's, they ran 4 and we contributed to one of them, if I remember rightly. We've come an awful long way since then, and I can imagine, you know, whoever's director of UK PONI in another 10 years, maybe it'll be me, maybe it'll be one of you, will hopefully have a similar track record of success to look back on. And hopefully, you know, I think this will be a very interesting, it will be a very interesting period, certainly. I think what we've done also is we've shown the case, the need for this nuclear community, the need for these people, for this group of thinkers, people who will think deeply, connect with each other, in a way that is collegiate and respectful and embodies that spirit of UK PONI, which is really about, you know, making sure that you engage with people, as one of our speakers suggested, who really disagree with you as much as those who do. I think the last thing we need now at this point is more echo chamber. I think we need more critical thought, more challenge to our own views and others, and for that challenge to be respectful. And I'm very, very proud that UK PONI has always embodied that. So those are just some reflections on what I've taken away from the last 3 days of conference. For those of you who've participated in all of it, I salute your stamina. I've had an endless well of coffee next to me, powering me through. I'm sure that many of you have as well. For those of you who didn't present but are interested in getting involved in UK PONI, there is the best way that you can initially get involved with writing, at least, is through our blog. Nuclear Reactions, the UK PONI blog. And if you have an idea for something that's been sparked by what you've seen today, you can fire it in to the email address there. It doesn't have to be an article to start with, it can be a concept. And who knows, maybe we can connect you up with somebody else who's thinking of writing on the same thing and you can do it together. One way of building across communities. That's probably enough for me right now. What I'd like to do is I'd like to transition into our closing keynote. He's a gentleman I know reasonably well now, having sat on a number of different panels, though I don't think I've ever chaired you yet, actually, Angus, so I'm looking forward to this one. Angus Lapsley, who's Director General Strategy and International in the MOD. As you'll see from your programs, he has an exceptional career in a number of different areas, but you know, most recently, and where Angus and I have interacted most often, is on Euro-Atlantic security issues, which I know from our conversations on this, Angus cares very deeply about. He's one of the UK government's thinkers on this, I would say, and he really does know his onions. So one of the things that we've spoken about, you don't laugh, Angus, you definitely do know your onions, and he is going to, I hope, contextualize some of the discussions that we've had over the last few days. And, you know, what does the UK's nuclear weapons status mean for Euro-Atlantic security? Why are we doing all these? Why do we take the steps that we do take? And how do we think about the changing world around us? So with that, over to you, Angus, and welcome.
Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm conscious that I'm probably what stands between everybody and their lockdown solitary gin and tonics rather than the collective drink, which is a great shame. But let me start by just recognizing the value and the importance of UK PONI. I mean, it's a great initiative, and I mean, I think of the things that I've spoken at, only the Stratcom symposium in Omaha, Nebraska comes close to having such a great group of people brought together. So let me just start by explaining my role a little bit. So I'm responsible in the Ministry of Defense for our overall approach to Euro-Atlantic security, our relationship with America and Europe, how we deal with Russia. And I'm also responsible for the international policy side of nuclear policy. I'm not responsible for the delivery of the UK nuclear programme. That's Vanessa Nichols, Director General Nuclear. And if you've been having a discussion about diversity, our Director General is a woman, our Director Nuclear Policy is a woman, and the desk officer who prepared most of the notes for my discussion today is a woman as well. So at least in that respect, there is some diversity appearing in MOD, although we have a really long way to go on most diversity issues in our organization. My background is I'm an English literature graduate, so I think it's probably fair to say that my grasp of the physics of nuclear weapons is probably unstable, is perhaps the best word to describe it. And I've spent most of my career in the civil service and most of it in the foreign office, and indeed I still belong to the diplomatic service. And I think it's quite interesting to note that I've come to, although I've been dealing with security policy for many years now, I've come to nuclear policy relatively late in my career. And I think that there is an issue which this group is really relevant to, actually, of maintaining and indeed rebuilding a community of policymakers and thinkers in Britain who are engaged in nuclear issues. Because I think there was definitely a period of perhaps 20 years or so where if you were an aspiring civil servant, diplomat, this might well have been not the area that you went to. You probably wanted to go and work on counterterrorism or counterinsurgency or things like that. And actually, as nuclear issues have become, I think, much more important to the balance of power and security in the world, it's really important that we grow a community, both either side of the policy and think tank or academic worlds. So we need you, basically. And I hope there's at least somebody listening today who will be inspired to think about a career in the MOD. My aim really is to do two things, neither of which are terribly sort of radical or controversial. First, I'll kind of give just a broad brush account of kind of where British nuclear policy sits and where it comes from. But then secondly, as you suggested, Tom, I'll reflect a bit on some of the challenges that we face in the Euro-Atlantic space at the moment. So just, briefly, to put some of the basics in context, Britain has been a nuclear power since 1952. We were the third country to become a nuclear power. Since 1958, we've had a nuclear sharing agreement with the United States. And since 1960, so that's 60 years now, we have made our nuclear forces available to NATO. And indeed, we are the only country which is actually prepared to put its nuclear forces directly under NATO control, subject, of course, to the Prime Minister's agreement. We were a founder signature of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I discovered recently came into force in 1970, a week before I came into force. So I regard myself as very much a child of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we have quite a long history of being a nuclear power, but actually there's a remarkable amount of consistency over that period in British policy. And the heart of that policy has always been that for us, nuclear weapons are about deterrence. But deterrence is not solely about nuclear weapons. Deterrence is also about diplomacy and communication. It's about conventional weapons. And increasingly, it's about other less conventional weapons, like, for example, cyber or indeed some space capabilities. But nuclear weapons have always been at the heart of our national thinking on deterrence, or at least since the 50s and 60s. And in many ways, as you know, the term deterrence frequently becomes synonymous with nuclear policy. Since the 1990s, we've been committed to a policy of having a minimum credible deterrent, i.e. the minimum amount of destructive power needed to deter any aggressor. And we're the only one of the nuclear powers who defines our policy in quite that way. We're also the only one of the NPT nuclear powers, at least, that has a single system for the delivery of our deterrent, based on having 4 SSBNs for nuclear submarines, one of which is on patrol at all times, continuous at-sea deterrence, which last year celebrated its 50th year of uninterrupted operations. We are deliberately ambiguous about how, when, and at what scale we would contemplate the use of our nuclear weapons. And that ambiguity is quite an important part of our doctrine and how we think deterrence works best. It's one reason why, for example, we've never declared a no first use policy. But we are clear that we'd only use nuclear weapons in the most extreme circumstances, and that only the Prime Minister can authorize their use, which I think is a kind of very clear recognition that nuclear weapons, at least for us, they are as much political as they are military in nature, and we don't regard them as a war-fighting tool. The NATO role that we play, is important to us, and I think there's a long-standing debate about whether, provided that America's nuclear weapons are there to protect NATO, whether it makes any sense for us or the French or indeed anyone else in Europe to play a role in that nuclear deterrence posture. And our view remains that, apart from the kind of ultimate national guarantee that nuclear weapons provide, having a second or a third decision-making center within NATO would complicate the calculus of any adversary. I think it's quite important to note that at the moment, the UK is going through a very major and necessarily expensive program of renewing our systems. So the 4 Vanguard class SSBNs that we operate now will go out of service in the early 2030s, and they'll be replaced by 4 Dreadnought class successor SSBNs. And we recently confirmed what I think most people had assumed was the case, which is that we will have a program to replace our warheads. And that'll be a national program. We're also, and this is perhaps sort of less noticed, we also have to continue to put substantive amounts of investment into infrastructure. And quite a lot of the conventional weapon systems that we have and that we are investing in at the moment are in some way linked to sustaining the nuclear enterprise. So having world-class SSNs, for example, the Astute class of attack submarines, the Type 26 frigate program, anti-submarine warfare frigates, and the recent acquisition of a fleet of Boeing P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. These are all capabilities which are linked, at least in part, to sustaining the nuclear enterprise. They have other roles as well, keeping sea lanes open to Europe across the North Atlantic, but they have a key role in supporting the deterrent. So the quick question is, from a defence perspective, does it make sense to invest all of that money in those kind of systems? And I think our view is very firmly yes, it does. And I would sort of draw kind of 2 points. One is that these are very, very long-term programs. We are building SSBNs now that will be in service probably, well, not. I hope the MPT will last for a very, very long time, but these things will almost certainly be in service after I've gone. So we're making very, very long-term decisions here and a long-term insurance policy for the nation. But in the short to medium term, I'm afraid the global security picture, the threat picture, does look pretty difficult. And you mentioned competition earlier, Tom, and I think we see increased state versus state competition and increased risks of conflict between states being one of the things that characterize the international security picture over the next 10, 20 years. Whereas for most of the last 20 years, we've been focused essentially on the problems of lack of states, the problems of terrorist groups and intrastate conflict. So we obviously think and have done throughout our nuclear experience, first and foremost in terms of Russia, a country whose political posture and its military posture has become progressively more aggressive and threatening over the last 10 years, whose military has modernized very considerably and continues to do so, and which has a doctrine of use of nuclear weapons, interestingly, and I'm sure you've been debating it, published last week, or at least a version of it was published last week, which makes very clear that they would contemplate using nuclear weapons in order to end a conventional conflict on their terms, in particular through the so-called escalate to de-escalate doctrine. Iran has obviously been a big concern for most of the last 20 years. Actually, it's been on the brink of a nuclear program. We remain committed to the agreement that was reached with Iran, the JCPOA. But it's obvious that that agreement is under great strain, and it's not obvious that we will be able to prevent Iran from going down that route. North Korea has de facto become a nuclear power in recent years. And then, of course, we watch the pace and scale of Chinese nuclear expansion with some concern. But that brings me to the Euro-Atlantic space and what is happening there. And I think I would draw out 4 themes of debate at the moment in the Euro-Atlantic space, by which I mean essentially issues which we're debating here in Europe. But of course, they engage Canada as well, and the US is always a major player. So I think the first is, faced with this more capable and aggressive Russia, a country which deliberately obfuscates nuclear and conventional threat. It's part of its approach is designed deliberately to make us uncertain as to what kind of military threat we're facing. I think faced with that, there is a big program going on in NATO, which is a transition which has been happening now for probably 4 or 5 years, maybe a bit longer, of rebuilding NATO's defense and deterrence posture. Now, this takes lots of different forms. It can take some very conventional forms, for example, the stationing of conventional forces in the Baltics, a British battle group, a German battle group, an American battle group, a Canadian battle group, etc. It takes the form of reform of conventional forces so that they are becoming more ready, more agile, able to respond to an emerging security crisis, particularly in Europe's eastern or southern or northern flanks, faster, in order to restore conventional deterrence before a crisis escalates. And that explains the importance of things like the NATO Readiness Initiative, or something which is less known at the moment because it hasn't yet been sort of rolled out publicly, but something called the Nato Defense, the concept for the defense and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area, which is something which defense ministers will be debating next week. In fact, like us, they'll be doing it remotely. But I think there's also some quite important changes in NATO about NATO's willingness to signal not just its political resolve, but the nature of the military force that backs that up. So it's quite striking that the last 2 NATO summits have had quite long communique sections on nuclear policy, because allies reached the view that they wanted to spell out very clearly to anyone who might need it to be spelled out to them, just where NATO stood and our credibility and will on nuclear issues. So, I would say, whilst we, and I'm sure this is true for the other nuclearists, we devote a lot of time to making sure that our nuclear deterrent is credible and effective. We quite rightly spend even more time thinking about how we maintain defense and deterrent credibility in the conventional space so that we never get to a point where a crisis might lead to the nuclear, to a nuclear dimension. I think the second big theme, and again, it'll be talking about this at NATO defense ministers next week, is the changed nature of the missile threat in Europe. So we have had Russian short-range missiles, Iskanders in particular, in Europe, and in particular in Kaliningrad, for some time now. That is not a new factor. But what changed things a bit more dramatically over the last couple of years is the emergence of a Russian intermediate range missile system, the SSC-8, which we and other NATO allies have judged to be an INF range missile. And the dispute with Russia over this, has, of course, led to the end of the INF treaty. And it has driven a process of reflection within NATO about how should we adapt to this new threat environment. And to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, I mean, the themes here are, these are weapon systems which are designed to be ambivalent or ambiguous about whether they are nuclear or conventional. They are designed to split NATO allies one from the other, because they are a way of saying, well, we might just hit this country, but don't worry, we wouldn't hit you, America, or perhaps we wouldn't hit you, France. We just have to deal with the problem we're having to deal with closer to home. So that they are aimed at, if you like, a kind of playing on NATO's cohesion and trying to see if it can be tested. There are also weapon systems which offer very little warning. One of the problems is you wouldn't know if you were being fired at with a conventional missile or a nuclear missile until it was all too late. There are also systems which can be moved around very easily. You don't know whether they're on the border with Belarus or on the other side of the Urals. It's very, very difficult to have a kind of meaningful understanding of what the strategic balance is. So these are destabilizing weapon systems, which of course is why the INF got rid of them in the first place back in the 1980s. So NATO is trying to work out at the moment how we respond to that. I think the response is likely to be quite complex. So it's likely to involve some changes to conventional capabilities and posture in order to maintain deterrence. It's likely to force us to think more about awareness, understanding of what's going on, sensor systems, for example. It's likely to take us into a world where we exercise more and we do more to understand how we would collectively as allies think through and respond to an emerging situation. Because one of the things you desperately want to avoid in a crisis is an unnecessary escalation, in particular to a nuclear scenario. And that is difficult. And going back to something I said very early on, we don't have a generation of policymakers and politicians who are used to thinking about these issues. So exercising and getting people into the mindset of how they would deal with particular situations, that becomes very important. I think the other NATO response will be to try and see if there is a way back to some kind of meaningful arms control. The INF Treaty is no more. The Open Skies Treaty has now been called into question, although I think we and other European allies remain very committed to it. Arms control is something Europeans, I think, care about a lot, because they think it matters, but also because it's politically important. So I think there will be European determination to see if we can get back to some kind of arms control. But of course, it needs two to tangle. And we need a Russia that is actually prepared to engage with that in a meaningful way, and not just to use it as a way of dividing and ruling. And that brings me to my third point, really, which is there is also a strategic arms control debate, which Europeans absolutely feel they have direct stakes in. So the future of New START and whether it is renewed or whether it is possible to have a negotiation, not just with Russia, but also possibly with China, about new strategic systems, about China's growth in weapons. These are issues on which Europeans take a view as well. And are watching to see where America goes with a lot of interest. And I think Europeans also need to keep thinking, and NATO is starting to do this, about sort of broader strategic stability questions. For example, whether some cyber capabilities upset the strategic balance that exists, broadly speaking, in the nuclear space. And of course, there are new weapon systems as well, nuclear powered torpedoes, cruise missiles, etc. The last point I just make on the Euro-Atlantic debate is that, I mentioned UK modernisation and the costs of that. In the UK, we have a pretty broad political consensus in favour of pushing ahead with that. It's not unanimity. There's always been some political opposition in Britain to the nuclear programme, but Parliament voted very strongly to push ahead with the building of the 4 new SSBNs. But there is a big modernisation programme happening in America. And that is, in some respects, politically contentious. The Democrats don't agree with all of the modernization plans that the Republicans have. And a number of European countries are going through the process of renewing their, basically their aircraft fleets, which are necessary for the continuation of the dual-capable aircraft mission, which is itself an important part of NATO's nuclear solidarity. And in some countries, that's quite a complex and politically sensitive debate. So it's not just Britain that kind of has to manage the politics of that at the moment. And I think, going back to my exercising point, I think there is a sort of broader need to, as we sometimes put it, raise the nuclear IQ of Europe, get more European governments and sometimes parliaments and publics just to understand a bit what the stakes are and the importance of approaching these issues with a kind of clear, lucid head. Let me just finish by just saying a word about the NPT, which, as I said earlier, I hope will, like me, have many years ahead of it. I mean, I'm sure that Under Secretary General Nakamitsu yesterday sort of reminded everybody of just what it offers, and we agree with her. I think she's dead right. There is a huge amount of value in the NPT, even if it hasn't delivered all of its original objectives. And I'm sure that, like a lot of the global multilateral order at the moment, it's going to be called into question. But Britain, I think, will be very, very firmly in favour of defending the NPT. And I think even if the ultimate goal of disarmament remains something which still looks a long way off, given that conditions don't allow it, we think there are things you can do to keep the NPT moving and behaving in a responsible way. So one thing that the UK has been instrumental in getting going in the last 18 months is a P5 dialogue between nuclear experts of the P5. So far, we've focused on exchanging information on doctrines as a confidence building and understanding building measure. And we think it's quite important that the P5 sets a responsible example here. Secondly, we think there are some practical steps that can be taken within the NPT around nuclear disarmament verification. Thirdly, there is a discussion which we continue to promote within the NPT and elsewhere on strategic risk reduction, looking at measures that all of the nuclear powers and others can take to try and reduce the risks of miscalculation. And lastly, I don't think we should forget the Nuclear Security Initiative agenda, which is really about making sure that nuclear materials don't inadvertently fall into the wrong non-state actors' hands. So I think I'll stop there, because I'm sure there'll be lots of sort of questions and challenge. But I'd say it is a kind of remarkably complex and rich moment to be thinking about these issues, which is why I think if I was starting my career in the civil service again, I would start here.
Very good. Well, I'm sure our delegates will be pleased to hear that. I know myself 10 years ago, I would have been similarly delighted. I mean, you talked about the broad political consensus in the UK on renewal, which I think is right. You also talked about the value to Europeans, and I would say probably including the UK, an instinctive positive inclination towards arms control. And you also talked earlier about minimum deterrence. So I'm wondering about the bounds, as you see it, of that political consensus. I know obviously you're a civil servant, so it's a different sort of set of questions. But I would argue, for example, there isn't a broad consensus around sort of the unrestrained renewal, the unrestrained, if if there were the government to propose a massive growth in the UK's nuclear arsenal, I'm not sure you would see the same consensus. Equally, there's always been an imperative towards some kind of disarmament or arms control step. So I'm just wondering, say, would that minimum deterrent that you indicate ever increase due to external security constraints, for example? And where would you see the UK plugging into future arms control?
I mean, to some extent, you're asking me to speculate on how our politics might play out, which is not something British civil servants do. But you know, I think it is worth noting that no government no government since the 50s has put forward a proposal for increasing the range of things that we want to do with our nuclear deterrent. The proposition has certainly, over the last 20 years, remained minimum credible deterrent. Of course, what could change at any point is what technically you need in order to achieve minimum credible deterrent. And you know, that is not something which is on the table at the moment. The proposal is to essentially replicate like for like with 4 submarines and 1 missile system. So I think, you know, I would distinguish between those 2 scenarios. You know, you could have a government which said, actually, we'd like to use nuclear weapons in more circumstances. And that, I can imagine, would be controversial in British politics. Or you could have a government which says, look, the mission has not changed, but we need to be quite radically different about how we perform that, how we achieve that mission, because the technology has changed or whatever. We're in neither situation at the moment. I think it's fair to say. And on arms control, you know, we've always tried to be engaged in and support arms control initiatives. We're part of the CTBT. We of course were not signatories to either New START or INF because they were bilateral American Russian treaties. But I think, you know, we would. I'm pretty clear that if there is a credible path towards either renewal of New START and its change in some way, or getting back to something like INF, the UK will want to play an active role in supporting that. What in a sense what we can't do is kind of put a lot of stuff on the table to make that easier, because by definition we have minimum credible deterrent. So it's not as though we have kind of spare deterrent to put on the table, if you like.
As we approach the end of the conference, all it remains for me to do is to thank you, Angus, for coming to speak to us and close the conference. Really appreciate it. And I know we asked you to cover an awful lot of ground there. I guess it comes with the territory. But no, you did a very good job, and I really appreciate that. And to all our attendees and panelists and chairs, and to our collaborators from Chatham House who helped us out with the exercise, in fact, provided the exercise that we did today, learning about the TPNW and arguments for and against. Thank you so much for your engagement, and thank you so much for your time as well. I know this was a very long conference, and I hope you really enjoyed participating in it. So yeah, we will be back in strength next year. Who knows? Hopefully we'll even be in person, but until then, we'll be putting together a good online program for us all to enjoy. Until then, I think it's just for me to close the 10th anniversary UK PONI annual conference and wish you all a very good evening. All the best to you all.